The first thing Corporal Dana Vasquez noticed when the Cathali ship descended over Madriel Station was that it moved wrong. Every alien vessel she'd studied in the 2 years since first contact had moved with a kind of architectural certainty. The choir's crystalline spires, the Voreth's slick black wedges, the consortium's bloated transports. They moved the way cathedrals would move if cathedrals could fly, with the grim confidence of things that had never once doubted themselves. The Cathali command ship moved the way a cat moves when it thinks no one is watching, casually, like the concept of urgency had been invented by lesser species and quietly dismissed. It drifted over the station's comm spire and just stopped, hanging in the amber morning sky like an afterthought, and every person on the observation deck of Madriel Station went silent in a way that had nothing to do with awe. Vasquez had been a tactical liaison for the Human Compact's 3rd Forward Observation Corps for 11 years. She had watched the choir disassemble a moon to make a point about territorial boundaries. She had been 3 clicks outside Voreth space when they turned an entire gas giant inside out to demonstrate what they called a minor atmospheric adjustment. She had filed 11 separate incident reports that Compact Command had buried so deep in classified storage that even the archivists didn't know they were there. She had never been afraid. That was the thing about Vasquez that her superior officers consistently failed to understand. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't brave in the way recruitment posters meant. Chin up, eyes bright, flag rippling somewhere behind her in a breeze that didn't exist. She was afraid of plenty of things. Confined spaces. Losing her sister. Particular way. A commanding officer's voice went flat when they were about to tell you someone wasn't coming back. She just wasn't afraid of dying in a way that mattered tactically. The distinction had kept her alive longer than any body armor. Fleet Admiral, she said, without looking away from the ship outside. That's the Cathali 7th Palatinate Standard. 3-ring sigil, gold on burgundy. That's not a patrol vessel. Fleet Admiral Hector Garm stood at the window beside her, hands clasped behind his back. Reflection in the transparasteel, a study in controlled blankness. He was a compact man, the kind of man who had never taken up more space than strictly necessary. And he'd held Madriel Station's command for 6 years without ever once raising his voice. Vasquez respected that more than she could say. "I can see what it is, Corporal," Garm said. "Sir, the 7th Palatinate flagship is the Keth Vorath. It's their equivalent of a Supreme Command vessel. It's what they send when they want us to know they're serious." "Yes." He turned from the window. "Get Commander Reyes. Get the translation team. And get me a pot of actual coffee, not the recycled bilge from the mess deck." Vasquez was already moving. "Sir, what do we tell the civilian population?" Garm was quiet for a beat. "Tell them we're handling it. And if they ask what it is, tell them it's a diplomatic visit." She paused. "Sir, with respect, that ship is 3 times the size of our primary station hub. Diplomatic visits don't usually require a ship you could fit a city inside." Hector Garm looked at her with the expression of a man who had been doing this job long enough to know exactly what kind of conversation was about to happen in the next few hours, and who was choosing, very deliberately, to take it 1 step at a time. "Then tell them it's a very important diplomatic visit," he said, "and get me my coffee." Cathali did not communicate through standard radio frequencies, tight beam transmissions, any of the 47 protocols the Compact's Xenolinguistics Division had established for exactly this kind of moment. They communicated by projecting a representative, not holographically, actually projecting. One moment the Heth Vorath was simply hanging there in the sky. The next, a Cathali arbiter was standing in the censure of Madriel Station's council chamber, as if it had always been there, and the room had simply not yet noticed. The Cathali were tall, nearly 3 meters, with a silhouette that looked like someone had taken a praying mantis and a cathedral ceiling and asked what they had in common. Their exoskeleton was a deep, iridescent blue that cycled through purples and blacks depending on the light. They had 4 primary limbs, 2 of which ended in something that functioned as hands, with too many joints, in directions human hands didn't have. Their secondary limbs folded close to the thorax and were rarely extended except in combat. They communicated through a combination of subsonic vibration, bioluminescent pattern shifts across their carapace, and a modulated chemical language that the compact had been trying to fully decode since the Madrial Accords 3 years prior. The translation rig the station's xenolinguistics team had assembled took about 4 seconds to render Kethali into standard. In those 4 seconds, the Arbiter had already delivered the first sentence. The translation read, "We have come to inform you that this system will be incorporated into the 7th Palatinate's resource framework within 37 of your planetary rotations." Commander Isabel Reyes, who had been translating Kethali for 2 years and had developed the approximate composure of a woman who had seen everything and found it mildly irritating, looked up from her console. "They said inform, not request," she noted. "The tonal marker is declarative, not subjunctive." "I caught that," Vasquez said. Fleet Admiral Garm sat at the head of the council table with his coffee cup and the expression of a man who had suspected this was going to be a long day and was now certain of it. "Tell them we've received their statement and we'd like to discuss it." Reyes translated. The Arbiter's carapace shifted through a pattern that the rig rendered, somewhat apologetically, as Kethali equivalent of polite incomprehension, as though the concept of discussing an already decided matter was charming in the way that a small animal insisting it is a large animal is charming. "There is nothing to discuss," came the translation. "Framework has already been filed with the Palatinate administrative body. We are here as a courtesy." "A courtesy," Garm repeated. "Yes. Thought it might be distressing for your population to find that they were already part of the Palatinate without prior notification. We are informing you." "This is the courtesy." Someone at the back of the room, Vasquez couldn't identify who, made a small noise that might have been a laugh or might have been a man deciding whether to have a stroke. Vasquez looked at Admiral Garm. Garm looked at his coffee. Garm set down his coffee. "All right," he said. "Tell them we appreciate the courtesy. Tell them we'd like to schedule a formal response session, a dialogue. Sit down, bilateral, whatever they'd like to call it." "What do I say is the purpose of the session?" Reyes asked. "Tell them. We want to present some information they may find relevant." The Arbiter processed this. Its secondary limbs shifted. A micro-expression the translation rig flagged as something between curiosity and amusement. "What information could you possibly present that is relevant to an administrative filing?" "Tell it," Garm said. "We have a few things they haven't calculated for." The session was scheduled. The Kethali agreed with the energy of beings who expected nothing to change, and found the theater of human negotiation entertaining in the way that watching a child attempt arithmetic is entertaining. Not because you expect a breakthrough, but because the attempt is its own small spectacle. In the 11 hours between the initial contact and the session, Madrial Station did not panic. Prized the Kethali Communications Intercept Team, which the Compact's Signals Division detected within 40 minutes, and whose monitoring protocols Vasquez spent 6 of those 11 hours studying with Commander Reyes's team. What the Kethali intercepts showed was not the frenzy of a civilian population coming apart at the prospect of occupation. They showed was something closer to a city deciding, quietly, to be annoyed. The mess decks stayed open. The supply teams ran their standard rotation schedules. 2 maintenance crews repaired a coolant conduit that had been leaking for 3 weeks. Chief Engineer Marta Sorrell submitted 4 separate maintenance tickets that she had been putting off and used the extended duty hours to finally fix. The water recycler on level 7, which had been making a sound like a dying goose for the better part of 2 months. In the station's small civilian quarter, a woman named Ola Burke, who ran the commissary, had heard the announcement that a Kethali command vessel had arrived, said, "Ah," and then organized the first full station community lunch in 6 months because she had been meaning to do it anyway, and now everyone was home. Vasquez found out about the lunch when she came off shift at hour 4 and discovered that the whole of the station's civilian corridor smelled like garlic and onions, and something that was either bread or the closest thing the recycler synthesized to bread tasted like bread if you didn't think about it too hard. She took a plate. She ate standing up in the corridor with the rest of the off-duty crew and 2 junior officers who had been on the observation deck when the ship appeared and who had spent the entire first hour very precisely not talking about what they'd seen, Because talking about it made it more real. You think they're going to fight? One of them asked eventually. He was young, 23 at most, with the scrubbed clean look of someone who had still not entirely reprocessed that, posted to a forward observation core, meant posted to the place, where things would happen first. That's the wrong question, Vasquez said. What's the right question? She thought about it. She had spent 11 years in forward observation. She had spent 11 years watching humanity get told, in one form or another, and by one species or another, that the math wasn't favorable, that the odds weren't good, that the correct response to an untenable situation was acknowledgement of the untenable situation, and that the human species would be wise to factor this into its expectations. In 11 years, she had never once seen the human species factor it in. The right question, she said, is what they haven't calculated for. The formal session opened with ceremony. The Kethali sent 3 arbiters, which was a significant increase from 1, and which translated, according to Commander Reyes's notes, as a gesture that was roughly equivalent to bringing reading glasses to a meeting you expected to be tedious, felt you should take seriously. The Compact's team included Fleet Admiral Garm, Commander Reyes, Vasquez, Chief Engineer Sorrell, the station's Chief Medical Officer Dr. Petros Anand, and, because Garm had a sense of humor that he kept in a very small compartment and deployed, rarely, Ola Burke from the commissary, because she had asked to come, and he had found it impossible to explain why she shouldn't, sat at the far end of the tab of the table with a notepad and a pen, and the calm expression of a woman who had run a commissary for 12 years, and had stopped being surprised by anything people were capable of around food, which had given her a philosophical flexibility that was now proving useful, in a different context. Garm opened. He was precise, measured, and deliberately untheatrical about it. He thanked the Palatinate for the courtesy of notification. He acknowledged the administrative filing. He said that the Compact's position was that the filing was in error, not from malice but from incomplete data, teams, and that the session was being held to provide the relevant information, so the Palatinate could update its administrative models. The lead arbiter's carapace shifted. The translation rig rendered this as, "What incomplete data?" Garm nodded to Vasquez. Vasquez had spent 4 of the 11 preparation hours on this, not on the presentation itself. The presentation was straightforward, data columns, and a series of historical reference points. She had spent those 4 hours thinking about the single most important thing she had learned in 11 years of watching humanity deal with alien civilizations that considered humanity's persistence a mathematical anomaly. Keth Ali were administrators. They had built an empire over 400 years through the systematic application of resource accounting, categorized civilizations the way a mining company categorizes a geological survey. What does this have? What will it take to extract it? And at what point does the extraction cost exceed the return? A species that fought back factored into the cost column. Species that fought back beyond projected casualty parameters were, statistically, reevaluated. The Kethali had never encountered a species that fought back specifically because it found the experience instructive. The Compact's relevant data, Vasquez said, concerns precedent. Specifically, the administrative filings the Palatinate has submitted for 11 other inhabited systems over past 60 years and what happened in each case. She brought up display 11 systems, 11 filings, 11 different species. In each case, she said, the Palatinate's projection model assumed a standard resistance arc, initial protest, extended negotiation, conditional compliance, incorporation. Your models are very good. For each of those 11 species, the compliance window occurred inside the projected range. The lead arbiter was entirely still. Stillness in a Kethali was the equivalent of leaning forward. We're the 12th filing, Vasquez said, and we've been looking at what makes the first 11 different from us. She clicked to the next display. Your model assumes that a species' resistance capacity is proportional to its military infrastructure. You weigh fleet assets, ground force numbers, weapons yield, supply chain, resilience, all of which is sensible, all of which is correct for the species you've incorporated. She paused. You don't have a variable in your model for what a species is willing to cost you even after it can no longer win. Silence in the room. Even Berkey had stopped writing on her notepad. "Let me tell you about Marta," Vasquez said. Chief Engineer Sorrell looked up from her seat. "Marta fixed a coolant conduit this morning," Vasquez said. "It had been leaking for 3 weeks. She fixed it this morning. During first contact with a command-level vessel from the most powerful administrative empire in this sector, because the work still needed doing and she was there. She clicked the display off. That's not a military metric. That's not anything you've got a column for." The session broke for 6 hours while the arbiters consulted with the Akethforath. In that time, Vasquez slept for 3 hours, woke up and went to find Garm. He was in the observation deck with his coffee, watching the ship outside. The way you watch something that you have made peace with and are not done thinking about. "You think it worked?" she asked. "I think we made them think," he said. "Whether thinking leads anywhere productive remains to be seen." She stood beside him and looked at the ship. In the morning light, it had a different quality than it had at dawn. Less threatening, more simply enormous. The way certain problems look different, depending on how much sleep you've had. "They don't understand stubbornness," she said. "It's not in their model. They understand resistance as a strategic posture. They don't understand resistance as a default mode. Explain the difference. Strategic resistance has an exit condition. You resist until the cost exceeds the projected outcome, and then you stop. Every species they've incorporated stopped when the math said stop." She looked at the ship. "We don't stop when the math says stop. We stop when we stop, which is usually later than the math recommends." Garm sipped his coffee. "That's either our greatest strength or our greatest flaw." "Might be both," Vasquez said. "We've been operating on both for a long time." The arbiters returned with a counterposition. The Palatinate, they said, prepared to reclassify the compact filing from Tier 3, Standard Resource Framework Incorporation, to Tier 1. Was the administrative designation reserved for civilizations with sufficient autonomous complexity to warrant what the Cathali called a lateral partnership arrangement. This was, the lead arbiter's carapace indicated, not a designation the Palatinate had extended in 63 years. "We want to be clear," the lead arbiter said through the translation rig, "that this is not a concession. It is a recalibration. We have reviewed the historical precedent you provided, and we acknowledge that our model had a variable gap." "Variable gap?" Commander Reyes murmured, in the tone of someone filing language away for later. "What does Tier 1 mean in practical terms?" Garm asked. "Mutual non-interference within compact-defined space. Trade framework negotiated bilaterally rather than assigned. Representation in the Palatinate Administrative Assembly at observer status. With provision for elevation to participatory status upon review. View by whom? The Assembly. What's the review period? The lead arbiter considered. Standard review period is 100 years. In the brief silence that followed, Vasquez heard Ola Burke write something on her notepad and underline it twice. "That's a long time," Garm said. "Yes, you are a young civilization. We're aware." Garm folded his hands on the table. "We'd want to negotiate the review timeline. You are in a position to negotiate very little. We're in a position to make incorporation sufficiently costly that negotiating is more economical than not negotiating," Garm said, without heat, without drama, in exactly the tone of a man reporting a weather forecast. "We're not saying that to threaten you. We're saying it because it's true, and you know it's true, and I think the most productive thing we can both do is acknowledge what's true and build something from there." The lead arbiter's carapace cycled through a pattern the translation rig flagged as requiring additional processing time. When the rendering came, it was, "You argue from weakness with the confidence of strength." "We argue from what we are," Garm said. "And what are you?" Garm picked up his coffee cup. He looked at it, the way a man looks at an object that has been with him through several difficult years and has never once let him down. He set it down. "We're the species that fixed the coolant conduit," he said. The negotiation ran for 9 days. On the second day, the Cathali sent a technical liaison team to study the station's operational infrastructure. Vasquez had expected them to be monitoring for military vulnerabilities. What she found, watching their behavior through the station's internal sensors, was that they spent most of their time watching the maintenance crews work. Not analyzing, watching. with what the cultural analysis team's best interpretation rendered as attention. On the fourth day, Chief Engineer Cyril submitted her 13th maintenance ticket since the Heketh arrived. The Kethali liaison team had been present for 11 of them. One of the Kethali technicians, a secondary rank operative who had not been introduced by name but whom Sorrel's team had taken to calling Bracken because of the geometry of its secondary limb resting posture, had begun, shadowing Sorrel's senior tech on rounds, not interfering, following. In the way an apprentice follows, was a behavioral category the Kethali cultural analysis files had no record of. On the sixth day, Burke invited the liaison team to the commissary for what she described to Fleet Admiral Garm as just lunch. Just lunch, Garm repeated. They've been working all day. Everyone needs lunch. They don't eat what we eat, Ola. Then they can watch and I'll explain what things are. That's still something. Garm looked at Burke for a long moment. He had the expression of a man who had stopped trying to explain certain things, because the person he was trying to explain them to had already done the thing and it had already worked. Send me a report, he said. The report Burke submitted that evening was 3 pages long and included a detailed description of what turned out to be 40 minutes during which she had explained to 2 Kethali liaison members what bread was, where it came from, how old the practice of making it was, what it meant in various human cultures, and why. When you were worried about something, there was a specific comfort in making it with your hands. The Kethali did not eat bread. They did not physiologically have any use for bread. But when Berkey put a loaf on the counter and broke it, the lead liaison's carapace displayed a pattern that the cultural analysis team spent 3 hours debating before settling on a translation that Vasquez thought was probably right. We have not seen this before. On the 8th day, one of the 3 arbiters asked Vasquez, directly and through the translation rig, why she had mentioned the coolant conduit in the initial session. Because it was true, she said. There are many true things. You chose that one. I chose the one that said the most about the rest. The arbiter's secondary limbs shifted. Explain. Vasquez thought about it. She had spent 11 years around humans in forward positions. People who were, by definition, first ones there. They were not, as a demographic, the bravest or the most competent or the most strategically gifted. They were, almost without exception, people who found meaning in the doing of things even when the doing of things had no guaranteed result. Fixed the conduit because the conduit needed fixing. Who made lunch because it was lunchtime. Filed maintenance tickets in the middle of diplomatic contact with a civilization that could convert their station into raw material, and not because they thought it would strategically impress anyone, but because it was Tuesday, and the water recycler was making a terrible sound. We do the work, even when the outcome is uncertain, she said. That's not courage. Courage is a choice about fear. This is something else. We do the work because the work matters independent of whether it comes to anything. And a species that will keep doing the work regardless of the odds is a species whose projected compliance window keeps not arriving. The arbiter was still. Your model projects when we'll give up, Vasquez said, but we've never given anyone a reliable timeline for that. The final session on the 9th day produced a document that the Compact's legal team spent 2 weeks arguing about in 3 separate languages, before agreeing was a legitimate binding framework. The terms: mutual recognition of sovereign space, defined by the Compact's current boundaries with expansion provisions negotiated in 20-year increments. Trade framework bilateral, Kethotli observer access to Compact space, with reciprocal access to Palatinate administrative space for Compact representatives, a provision that had not been extended to any incorporated or partnered civilization since the Palatinate's 3rd century. Review period for participatory assembly status, 25 years, not 100. Heketh Vorath left Madriel Shainstein's sky on the morning of the 10th day. It moved the same way it had arrived. That odd, casual drift of something that had never doubted itself, except that it now had at least one thing it hadn't arrived with, a variable gap in its model that its administrative body was going to have to figure out how to fill. Vasquez watched it go from the observation deck, cup of something that approximated coffee in her hand, the station at her back running its standard morning rotation. Fleet Admiral Garm stood beside her. Brack asked to stay, he said. She looked at him. The liaison technician. The liaison submitted a formal request through the arbiters to remain for what it called extended operational study. The request used the Kethfleet equivalent of apprenticeship. He paused. The Kethfleet have no word for apprenticeship. It assembled the concept from adjacent vocabulary. Vasquez thought about Brackett shadowing Sorrell's senior tech through maintenance rounds, about the particular quality of attention, not analysis, not surveillance, that she'd seen in the sensor footage, the way Brackett had stood at the back of the commissary while Berkey broke bread. What did you say? I said yes. Garm sipped his approximated coffee. Marta's already given it a toolkit. Outside, the Keth Vorath was a point of reflected light, and then it wasn't. The morning sky over Madriel Station was the same pale amber it always was, the same slight haze from the processing towers on the station's eastern side, and the same distant smear of cloud against the upper atmosphere that meant it would rain by afternoon. Below, in the corridor outside the commissary, Vasquez could already hear the early shift coming in, the clatter of trays, a laugh, someone's voice rising over the general noise, with a question about whether there was real bread today or the recycler kind, voice answering from somewhere farther in. Vasquez stood there for a while longer, not because there was anything left to see outside, because 11 years of forward observation had given her a habit of staying in the present moment, slightly longer than the moment technically, required just to make sure she had all of it. The ship was gone. The negotiation was done. The water recycler on level 7 was still making a noise, but Marta had a ticket in on it and would get to it before end of shift. Good morning, Admiral, she said, and went to find breakfast. 3 months later, the Kethali Administrative Assembly sent a formal inquiry to the Compact's diplomatic office requesting documentation on what it called the human operational continuity phenomenon. The inquiry was 17 pages long and extremely precise in its confusion. It asked for data on how many of Compact's civilian personnel had continued standard operational routines during the Madriel contact period. It asked for demographic breakdowns. It asked for psychological profiles. It asked what training program produced the specific behavioral cluster it had identified as proceeding with task completion in the presence of existential threat. Commander Reyes drafted a response. She submitted it to Fleet Admiral Garm for review before sending. He read it twice, added one sentence and cleared it. The response was 3 paragraphs. It noted that the Compact had no specific training program for the behavioral cluster in question. It noted that the cluster was not considered unusual within the Compact's population and did not correspond to any specific demographic or professional category. It noted that documentation was available on any number of human historical and cultural practices that might for context, including but not limited to agriculture, construction, long-distance trade, medicine, music, the raising of children, and the making of bread. The sentence Garm had added was the last one. We've found that the most reliable indicator of a civilization's long-term resilience is not what it does when things are going well, but what it does when they are not, and whether the answer to both is more or less the same. The Assembly's follow-up inquiry, which arrived 6 weeks later, 63 pages and contained a section Reyes flagged as historically unprecedented. A formal acknowledgement that the Palatinate's administrative model required structural review. It also contained, in a footnote so technically dry that 3 people in the xenolinguistics team initially skimmed past it, a secondary request. Would the Compact be willing to send a representative to address the Assembly in person on the subject of what the Palatinate was now formally calling, in its own translated vocabulary, the persistence variable? Reyes found Vasquez on the observation deck when she got the message, as she usually found Vasquez, standing somewhere with a view of outside, coffee, and with the air of someone who was thinking about several things at once, and not yet ready to talk about any of them. You know what they're asking for, Reyes said. I know. You know who they'll want to go. Vasquez looked out at the sky. Brackett was in the engineering bay with Sorrell's team, 2 levels down, learning how to calibrate a plasma relay. It had been there every day for 3 months. Its carapace had developed a new resting pattern, that none of the cultural analysis team's existing databases could classify, something that registered in the bioluminescent spectrum just at the edge of the sensor's range, occurring whenever it was in the middle of working through a problem. Reyes's best guess was that it translated to something like, "I am in the middle, figuring this out." None of them had corrected that translation, because it seemed accurate, and because they found they liked having a word for it. "I'll go," Vasquez said, "to the Palatinate Assembly. Someone has to explain it to them, and it should probably be someone who's been explaining it for a while." Reyes looked at her. "What will you tell them?" Vasquez was quiet for a moment. Outside, the sky was doing what it did in the late afternoon, going from pale amber to a deeper gold, with a cloud cover from the west coming in, slow and even, the way weather moved when it wasn't in a hurry. "I'll tell them about the conduit," she said. "And then I'll tell them about the bread. And then I'll let them ask questions, because questions will be more useful than anything I can prepare in advance." "That's not much of a plan." "It's not a plan," Vasquez said. "It's what I'm going to do. Plans imply you know how it turns out." She finished her coffee. "We've never been especially good at stopping when the plan runs out." Reyes said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Garm's going to want to clear whatever you present to the assembly. He can add a sentence. He usually does. He's usually right." Outside, first rain began, thin and quiet and without fanfare, the way rain usually came to Madriel Station, as if it had simply been there all along, and you were only just noticing. It ran down the observation deck window in long, slow lines, and made the light outside look like something underwater, soft and diffuse and without hard edges. Somewhere below, Vasquez could hear the commissary starting up for the evening rotation, crew setting out trays, the recycler's low hum, the sound of the station being itself, without ceremony, the same as it had been the morning the Keth Vorath appeared, and the morning it left, and every morning in between. Vasquez stood there for a while longer. Then she went to pack. The Cathali Palatinate Administrative Assembly convened 4 times per local year, in a chamber at the center of the Palatinate's administrative capital, a city called, in the closest translation the Compact's linguists could render, the place from which all accounting is done. The city was old. The chamber was older. The assembly had met in it for 300 years and had not, in that time, extended a formal invitation to a representative of a non-incorporated species to address it. Vasquez arrived on a transport that the Palatinate had sent, enormous, impeccably maintained, crewed entirely by Cathali who behaved toward her with the careful precision of people doing something for the first time, and aware of it. They showed her to quarters. They provided with evident prior research, food she could actually eat, of the crew. A junior navigator, whose name rendered in standard as something close to Tilk's, stopped her in the corridor on the second day of transit and asked if she would explain what she was going to say. "I don't know yet," she said. "Tilk's processed this. You are going to address the assembly in 4 days without knowing what you will say. I know what I want them to understand. I don't know exactly how I'll say it. That tends to depend on the room." Tilks considered her. "Does that not make you afraid?" Vasquez thought about it. Not the performed consideration of someone stalling, actual thought, the kind you do when the question is good enough to deserve it. "Sure," she said. "But I'm going to do it anyway, and the doing will be more useful than worrying about it beforehand." Tilks's carapace did the thing that Vasquez had started to be able to read, slightly. After 3 months of watching Bracket, the color cycle at the edge of the bioluminescent range, just at the limit of perception, the one that meant something like being in the middle of figuring it out. "I think," Tilks said carefully, "this is what the assembly is trying to understand." "I know," Vasquez said. "Let me know if you have more questions." She got to the assembly 4 days later. She stood at the address point in the center of the chamber, 300 Cathali arbiters, ranged in their tiered configuration around her, the ambient sound of the chamber's ventilation system, a low, constant pressure at the edge of hearing. She had 1 sheet of notes. She'd written them on the transport. They were not an outline. They were the words, conduit, bread, bracket, 25 years, the work, and a line drawing of a cup of coffee that she'd added in the last hour because she felt it was relevant. She told them about the conduit. She told them about the lunch. She told them about Brackett in the engineering bay, learning to calibrate a plasma relay, with its carapace doing the thing that meant it was in the middle of figuring something out. And how the team had named that thing, had given it a word, because it kept happening, and things that keep happening deserve words. She told them about the maintenance tickets, about the water recycler, about the bread. She told them that the persistence variable was not a technology. It was not a training protocol. It was not a cultural survival mechanism in any sense that could be transferred or taught or replicated by a species that was not, at some baseline level, already doing it. We do the work, she said, because the work is there. We fix the conduit because the conduit leaks. We make the bread because it is lunchtime, and people need to eat. And there is something in the making of it that is about more than the bread. We show up to the negotiation without knowing if it will go well because not showing up guarantees it won't. She paused. We have a saying. There are a lot of versions of it. The version I prefer is this: the only way out is through. The chamber was quiet. 300 Cathali, absolutely still. You've been trying to understand why we don't give you a reliable compliance window, she said. I'll tell you why. Because compliance windows require an endpoint. And we're not looking for an endpoint. We're looking for the next thing. We're always looking for the next thing. She looked out at the chamber. That's not a strategic posture. It's not a psychological profile. It's what we are. And what we are is not going to stop being what we are, because the math in your model says the odds are long. She stopped. She had more notes, but she found she'd said it. I'll take questions, she said. The questions ran for 6 hours. When it was over, the Assembly's administrative secretary, a role that did not have an equivalent in compact governance, but that functioned approximately as an institutional memory keeper and procedural anchor, approached Vasquez as the chamber cleared. Its carapace was old. The iridescent blue foil faded toward gray at the edges in a way that the cultural analysis team's files indicated was associated with extreme age in Keth, physiology. It stood in front of her for a moment without the translation rig active. Then it produced, from a secondary limb compartment, something that had been folded very precisely, a piece of paper human standard size. With text on it, Vasquez unfolded it. It was a maintenance ticket. Filed 3 months ago on the 3rd day of the Madrigal Station contact period. Ticket number 13. Requester, Chief Engineer M. Sorrell. Subject, Water Recycler Level 7 Abnormal Sound. Status, completed the liaison, Vasquez said. Brack. The secretary's carapace shifted. The translation rig was off, but Vasquez had spent 3 months watching the patterns, and she wasn't certain, but she thought she knew what that one meant. We have not seen this before. She folded the ticket carefully and put it in her pocket. Outside the assembly chamber, the city that meant, the place from which all accounting is done, went about its business in the long alien afternoon, enormous and precise and very old, doing the work of 3 centuries without interruption. Vasquez stood at the entrance and looked at it for a moment. Then she went to find something to eat. She got home to Madrigal Station 7 weeks later. The transport was smaller this time. Compact issue, crew of 8, a pilot named Domingo, who talked too much, and was a magnificent pilot, which was a combination Vasquez had encountered before and had made her peace. Brackett met her at the docking bay. It had a toolkit in 2 of its hands and engine lubricant on its carapace, in a way that suggested it had come directly from a repair job, and had not stopped to think about appearances, which was, Vasquez reflected, a very specific kind of progress. Sorrell was there too, with coffee. Actual coffee, which meant she'd used up her personal requisition for the month and didn't care. How'd it go? Sorrell asked. Vasquez took the coffee. 6 hours of questions. Good questions, mostly good. A few I didn't have answers to. What did you say to those? I said I didn't know yet and I'd follow up. Sorrell nodded. This was the correct answer. In Sorrell's professional experience, I don't know yet was the beginning of most things worth doing. Anything change, she asked. Maybe, Vasquez said. Hard to tell from this close. She looked around the docking bay, the standard rotation hum, a supply team offloading a courier shipment, 2 bays over. The distant clang of something being repaired on the upper level. How's the water recycler? Running fine, Sorrell said. Fixed it the same day you left. I know, I read the ticket. Brackett's carapace shifted. The pattern at the edge of the bioluminescent range, the one that meant the middle of figuring something out. Then, more slowly, another pattern that Vasquez didn't have a translation for. The cultural analysis team hadn't classified it yet. She'd have to ask Reyes to run it. She finished her coffee, she picked up her bag, she went back to work. Coolant conduit on level 3 held a steady. The water recycler on level 7 ran quiet. Chief Engineer Marta Sorrell filed her 14th maintenance ticket of the month, and her 15th, and began on the 16th. Outside, in the pale amber sky, nothing larger than a supply courier had entered Madriel Station's approach corridor in 7 weeks. The clouds came in from the west the way they always did. The rain came when it was ready. The station kept going the way it always had, forward, without ceremony, into whatever came next. That was the thing about humans that the Kethali Administrative Assembly had spent 63 pages trying to express and had not quite managed, but that Vasquez thought about sometimes, standing in the observation deck with coffee that approximated coffee, watching the sky go from amber to gold to the deep blue of a night that was just another night and not the end of anything. You couldn't threaten it out of them. You couldn't math it out of them. You couldn't file it in a column, or project it on a curve, or assign it a compliance window, because it wasn't a response to a situation. It was prior to the situation. It was just what they were, the next thing, always the next thing. And the thing after that,